All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to take off my Bridges for People mask. Hopefully many of you have those. Welcome to the first ever Bridges for People teach-in. My name is Blythe Austin, and I am the co-chair of the Bridges for People campaign. Tonight, we're going to talk about New York City's bridges. Specifically, how do we bridge their car-centric present and a people-centered future? We have over 100 people registered to attend tonight and 4 incredible panelists to hear from. Now, before we start, let me tell you how this evening is going to run. Each panelist is going to speak for 10 minutes. After all 4 have spoken, we'll have a moderated discussion among the panelists. Then we're going to open it up to questions from you. You can ask questions by typing them into the question box. Raquel Thompson, one of our lead volunteers, will pose your questions to the panelists. At the end of the evening, my campaign co-chair, Courtney Williams, will close us out. Now, let me tell you all a little bit more about the Bridges for People campaign. Bridges for People is led by volunteers from the Brooklyn Activist Committee of Transportation Alternatives. We have volunteers from all over New York City who devote their time and passion to this campaign. The campaign started last summer specifically to focus on increasing pedestrian and cycling space on and around the 3 bridges that connect Brooklyn and Manhattan. We have had a number of events over the past several months, including the Bridges to Food Challenge, where people walked or biked over the bridges to support neighborhood restaurants, Walk the Bridges, when New Yorkers walked over all 3 bridges in one day, and Halloween, when people biked from and across bridges in all 5 boroughs to convene at Gracie Mansion and asked the mayor to increase space for people on New York City's bridges. We recently celebrated our first campaign victory when Mayor de Blasio announced that he would convert 1 lane into a 2-way bike lane on the Brooklyn and Queensboro bridges. This was an enormous accomplishment, especially for the Queensboro Bridge, where volunteers from the TA Queens Committee have been campaigning for this lane conversion for years. However, this is only the beginning. For the 3 bridges that connect Manhattan and Brooklyn, a single 8-foot wide lane for 2-way bike traffic is not sufficient. We want more. We want space dedicated to bikes on either side of the bridges so that cyclists can bike from the bridges to their destinations safely. We want increased space for bikes and pedestrians on the Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges. And on the Brooklyn Bridge, we want double the bike space that the mayor has promised by having DOT convert a 2nd vehicle lane into a bike lane as well. This campaign is no longer just about Brooklyn and Manhattan. It has grown into a movement to transform our bridges all over the city, because every bridge in New York should be a bridge for the people. We've invited these 4 panelists here tonight to help us imagine a future for our bridges that centers on the needs of all of us, not just the needs of the few who drive cars. So now I'm going to hand it over to Diane Martins, who is another lead volunteer who has spent many hours organizing this event for us tonight. And Diane will introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name's Diane, and I'll be introducing our panelists tonight. To kick things off, I'm pleased to welcome Danny Harris, the Executive Director at Transportation Alternatives, New York City's leading walking, biking, and public transit advocacy group. Danny's a leading voice in building cities that are for people, not cars. Previously, he spent 4 years as a program director with the Knight Foundation in San Jose, where he supervised grant making related to placemaking, transportation, and affordable housing. Danny's a native New Yorker and currently resides in Manhattan with his family. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Blythe. Thank you, Catherine. I'm so honored to be here representing Transportation Alternatives and to join this panel with wonderful colleagues in Courtney, Andrew, and Councilmember Levin, who've been sort of incredible in helping to build and grow this movement. So if I may, I'd like to walk you through some slides and a vision of how we see the city and how we see this campaign. If I can start, you'll notice that there's no coincidence between the campaign that TA, led by Blythe and Catherine and our activists, led, and the name that was adopted by our mayor when the campaign did roll out. I just want to start with something that's relatively simple, and I think that too many people overlook, which is that this is what New York looks like. Even as our traffic comes back, this is what our normal is in New York. And we know that normal has no shortage of externalities of what it means for healthcare workers who have the longest commute time in New York, low income and communities of color that have continued to be left behind by our disastrous transportation policy, knowing that commute time is one of the single biggest indicators of moving people out of generational poverty, that transportation in New York is the second leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, and the list can go on and on from there. So quite simply, when we think about what normal is, it's also abnormal that all of us have to gather and continue to fight for decades, especially in the case of bridges, for minor improvements that increase safety, add accessibility, and ultimately give transportation options to all New Yorkers so that those who are stranded in transit deserts, who have the luxury of purchasing a vehicle, don't have to spend $10,000 a year on car-related payments. And for those without that luxury, they don't have to spend hours stuck on buses or taking subways to get where they need to go simply to get to work or to bring their children to school. So I think as a starting point, I come with hope of what we'll build together, and also as an advocate and somebody who's worked in this field for quite some time, some anger that this is still what we have to fight for day in and day out. And we have the privilege to do so, to gather here today. There are too many New Yorkers who do not have that privilege to fight for better change in their neighborhood or to be empowered with the type of ideas and resources to bring about change in their community or with their city. So quite simply, Transportation Alternatives has been around for more than 50 years, almost 50 years. And I like to think of our goal quite simply as helping to solve this equation, which is pretty simple and it's infinitely hard to get to, but it's space minus cars equals quality of life. We know that the amount of space in New York is limited, and it's certainly at a premium. We know that the amount of car space right now is about 75% of our public right-of-way. We have over 19,000 lane miles for traffic. We have over 3 million free parking spaces. And again, we call this normal. And as we do chip away at that space for cars, whether it's on our bridges or on open streets or bike lane or protected bike lanes or protected bus lanes, we have the data that overwhelmingly proves that this is effective. When you look at obviously what's happened at the pedestrianization of Times Square, you look at the transformation of the 14th Street busway, you look at protected bikeways that are growing at maybe a snail's pace across the city, but they're certainly growing. We see that it is impacting and bringing about change that supports all New Yorkers, especially when we know that protected bike lanes make street conditions safer for everybody, not just for those on a bicycle. And when we look at our bridges, similar to our streetscape, it is important to remember that what we're talking about here is that we don't need an Elon Musk to come in and build a hyperloop, or we don't need flying cars, and we don't need autonomous vehicles. We quite simply as a city need to look to our past, where our streets and our bridges primarily moved people walking, people riding bicycles, people using public transit. This is what our bridges and most of our streets look like before they started to look like this, where pedestrians and cyclists were sort of relegating to a rounding error of space on these bridges, which primarily moved vehicles. And I should add that these vehicles are getting increasingly larger. Right now, about 72% of all vehicles sold in the United States are SUVs or light trucks, what I call assault vehicles. These vehicles are only growing. It's expected to be around 78% by 2025. Our city, in essence, is prioritizing 6,500-pound assault vehicles over our children, over those who need to get around and get to work, over healthcare workers, over our most vulnerable communities, over those with limited abilities, over my parents and maybe your parents or your grandparents who happen to live in the city, who want to simply age in place and be able to cross the street without fear of traffic violence. This simple representation that we see here, where on the Queensboro Bridge, half of a lane, or I should say a quarter of a lane, is devoted to bicycles moving in one way, and a quarter is directed to those who are moving the other way, across two of the largest boroughs in New York, and this is the only bridge crossing. This is unacceptable. And so as we've seen over the course of the last year amid the tragedy of COVID, is that bikes have been a pathway for our recovery. Bikes have been a pathway for people, especially essential workers, to get to work, to move around, to continue to move supplies and goods, to get healthcare workers to critical jobs. And we've seen that cycling, again, if we sort of look at our past, cycling continues to be a way where people can get around. And whether it's to step out and get to work, or to get their kids to school, or to get a bit of exercise, we've simply seen that cycling has increased exponentially. And I'm sure many of you or most of you know, because you're out there riding, or if you've simply tried to go to a bike shop and either buy a bike or get your bike fixed, you see that there is a surge on cycling in this city. And this is supported by data. We obviously have the qualitative points as well that you may be seeing on your street or from your own experience. We know that bridge crossings, which is an important indicator for the health of cycling, has been up. And I think it's important to remember also, especially when we talk about bridge counts, or even look at the fact that it was in September of this year, I believe September the 12th, that City Bike has its highest day of ridership. As you likely recall, these were not very vibrant days for tourism in New York. These are mostly New Yorkers who are riding their bikes, mostly New Yorkers who are leaning on city bikes, who are going back and forth over bridges, especially essential workers who are crossing bridges, especially the Queensboro Bridge. What we're seeing is that New Yorkers have increasingly been relying on these essential tools to move around and to keep our city moving. When we look at our bridges, and especially look to Queensboro Bridge, where in talking with my predecessors, this has been a campaign in the works for more than 40 years. Again, 40 years to get a minimal amount of space so that those who walk and ride a bike can get across the bridge safely. Under the incredible leadership of Juan Restrepo, who's on the call with us, our Queens organizer, and working in partnership with his colleagues and partners across Queens and on the Manhattan side, was launching this campaign to take the South Outer Roadway and turn it into more space so that we could ultimately double the amount of space for pedestrians and cyclists. This helped to inspire the Bridges for People campaign and was built on decades of advocacy and support, and I'd say growing anger among those who ride back and forth, including those who are injured or seriously injured or killed on either side of the bridge or on it, quite simply from the lack of space. So under the leadership of Catherine and Blythe and so many others on the Brooklyn Activist Committee, they took on the leadership to elevate and accelerate this campaign and to bring it across the Brooklyn Manhattan crossings. And I think it's important when we talk about the DNA of a campaign, especially those that are not just successful and those that are not successful, is really understanding what is it that make these things work and work effectively, especially when we look at what's happening across the landscape of New York now, this growing bike boom, more open streets, sort of a new opportunity to look at our streets differently as an asset instead of just asphalt. So obviously this work needs to be driven by and built around community. So in terms of understanding community needs, understanding how the community sees and perceives and recognizes the opportunity or challenge around the bridge on both sides. So it was building with that partnership that TA had helped to lead under the auspices of our activist committee that really started to understand where the opportunities were on both sides of the bridges. Thinking about creative events that would draw attention to the inequity of space on our bridges, and also looking at the critical targets, both the electeds, looking at the mayor, looking at DOT, and helping to sort of push back on these endless studies that go nowhere, and maybe at best they sit on a shelf. If people have to study whether people on bicycles weigh more than vehicles, there's something wrong about that study. Understanding key groups, understanding who some of the key leaders are, not just who can move this work forward, but help to actually ensure that it happens, and helping to raise and elevate their voices. And obviously looking at opportunities across social media, not just to elevate the conversation, but to welcome more people in, especially those who do use social media or maybe using their bike to cross the bridges, or just might be interested in these issues because of transportation equity or environmental justice, or maybe they've never even taken their bike across the bridge, but they're just curious to do so. So thinking about how we can bring about more tools, and Blythe, you had mentioned a number of the events, I don't want to rehash them, but thinking of creative ways where people can come out and experience the bridge and also use it as an opportunity to show the inequity and also to make a bit of a spectacle around it, whether it's the Hollow Wheels ride, and I was so grateful to join you all at Gracie Mansion, as we sort of called on the mayor right outside of his home to create bridges for people, to the launch event. And Courtney, I'm so glad that you're here, and thinking about moving around to encourage local restaurants, or even just to think creatively about how we can bring more people, including the electeds, to the table. When we look especially at the Queensboro campaign here, it's critically important that we had elected leaders on both sides of the bridge, not just stand up and say that they would do this, but that they were willing to put their money where their mouth was. We still need to ensure that that money does get to where it needs to be. But this is about making sure that electeds also understand that we have a voice and we speak with the community, and it's important that these issues happen. And again, we're not just talking about transportation here. I think it's critical that we understand that this is not just about bikes and walking. This is about equity. This is about public health. This is about supporting essential workers. This is about safety. This is about creating a more accessible city where people can get around and have options. If our city removes options from individuals, especially from low income and communities of color, it's ultimately locking people into generations of poverty or an inability to access and celebrate the city that they should be able to love and have full access to. Again, under Juan's leadership, we helped to take over the bridge, the South Outer Roadway. I marched with, I'm sure, hundreds of you across the bridge just to show what could be possible. And again, what an incredible celebration to have so many people take over the bridge and make it ours for a day. And again, to help to show what's possible and to demand that our city take this work seriously after more than 40 decades. As you all have seen, we're gathered here because we did get some success. While we're incredibly happy that we've made some progress, I think I would agree with Blythe and hopefully all of you that we are far from done, and we are far from even complete on these two bridges. We need more space, and quite simply, fighting for over 40 years to get just one lane isn't enough. We need to reimagine what our city looks like. And so as we think about our next steps as an organization, I wanted to just share with you a few ideas on the Bridges for People campaign, but also turn into a larger idea that I hope, if you haven't seen, you'd consider joining us on. So we need to obviously watchdog the process at DOT, ensure that this stuff happens on schedule, hopefully even before so, but we're also realistic of where we are as a city. That doesn't mean we stop watchdogging, but we know that these timelines keep moving, and it's important that we get this work done as quickly as possible. We need to be fighting for more lanes and on more bridges. And we need to be able to bring in more community groups, both those who are on both sides and adjacent neighborhoods to bridges, but those who live on both sides of all the bridges across New York. They should see this as an inspiration. And I hope many of you, may be connected to another bridge around New York. Let this be the fire that's lit under you to help fight for more bridges for people and space for people. We're heartened to see some legislation being advanced up in Albany that would put a call for the MTA to study and hopefully take more action about protected bike lanes and bike parking on bridges, but also at other MTA locations. And I just want to close with our 25 by 25 campaign. We're calling on the city to move away from this piecemeal approach and to think holistically about repurposing our city. We're calling for our next elected leaders to repurpose 25% of our street space by 2025. It's time to correct this imbalance and move away from the trench warfare that too many of us have been forced to fight and to focus on wide-scale issues. I encourage you to look at the report where we lay out some bold, ambitious ideas of what could be about, from 500 lanes of protected bike lanes to 1,000 miles of protected open streets to taking trash off of our sidewalk. We know that this is not just good policy, but it's good politics. The majority of New York voters across boroughs, across ages, across demographics support more amenities in their neighborhood, even at the expense of fewer parking spaces or fewer travel lanes. So again, good policy, good politics, and most importantly, the time to act is now. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share with you and eager to hear from my colleagues and answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for getting us off to an exciting start. Your vision for the future for our bridges and the 25 by 25 campaign is bold and inspirational. Our next speaker is Courtney Williams. Courtney founded the field of bike advocacy consulting with her project, The Brown Bike Girl. Courtney helps bike and transportation-oriented organizations create and refine initiatives that make cycling more inclusive and accessible to communities of color. She's enabled hundreds of Black and Brown New Yorkers to receive the health and mobility benefits of cycling through her tenure as NYCDOH's cultivator of bike culture in East Brooklyn, as a trainer for El Barrio Bike Coalition of East Harlem, as NYC.'s 2018 lead of cyclist education. She's also minted 24 professionally skilled ride leaders from across the boroughs. Courtney was named the first People's Bike Mayor of NYC by the International Bikes Network in 2020 because of her commitment to racial influence mobility justice. And during the pandemic, Courtney has addressed the disproportionate intersectional health and race impact of COVID by conducting large-scale bike repair and education days known as the Big Fix Initiative for low-income BIPOC neighborhoods. Courtney, welcome.
Hello. Yeah, I'm always ashamed how long that bio takes, but it's all good. Thank you for having me this evening. I'm here because I think about equity in all aspects. There's so many words in social justice. I'm really not a fan of all of the buzzwords that happen. And one of the ways that I approach equitable advocacy and helping people orient themselves is really about demystifying and taking on concepts and breaking them down. So I hope that I can help with that when it comes to the Bridges for People, which has been doing a great job, and I'm very happy at the strides that have been made because of the pressure of the people. So good job to all those colleagues. So I've written some stuff for you, so here we go. The fact that we need more space on bridges is quite obvious. To anybody who uses transportation, especially the bike and micromobility set, where there's allowances, it's observable that space is too narrow. And we are practically at this point interacting as though we are on a packed subway train while people try to get off of the subway. We see each other, but as equity advocate, I can tell you that I know that we aren't seeing each other. It's not an uncommon experience for people of color to have the awareness of space and interaction that our white colleagues and peers and neighbors do not. So I would like to say, if we were to think about usership as parallel to ownership in a hypothetical state in the pre-pandemic times, our interborough bridges of New York City would belong far more greatly to Black and Brown New Yorkers, immigrants, and low-income people, that in a way that surpasses the proportion that they have of elected or organized power in New York City. And the people who are working hardest are also walking the farthest, cycling the hardest, doing our commercial work, getting our deliveries for us. And as our bicycle boom has flourished, it's causing everything to be less safe. Yes, absolutely less safe in terms of the fact that the pathways themselves are congested. They're not large enough. And these are, any transportation person can acknowledge that these are the worst circumstances because we need a separation of modal space. Outside of the Bridges campaign, that's what advocates want. We want bike lanes so that we can have our own space. And atop those bike lanes, we would like protected bike lanes that fully remove us from cars. And in that lack of space, we also are unable to have the confidence to control our bicycles and micromobility devices. We can't move predictably. And these are the things that are the tenets of defensive bicycling, right? That stop us from having the crash that every cyclist is fearful of. And the bike community is used to thinking just in that terms, that Safety is all about not crashing, not having a bad interaction with a car. We're the environmental good guys. We deserve all of this. But our concept of ourselves, as far as advocates are concerned, needs to be broader. It needs to be about less about the inconvenience and discomfort that can lead to a crash, right? And your ability to go fast, and more so realizing who is around you in these spaces, identity wise, and recognizing that as we're shoulder to shoulder, and if we go back to that, who's been dominating the space longest, who's actually experiencing the most adjustment, it is those Black and brown bodies who are walking and cycling. And the rest of this influx of privileged white folks who can choose to commute, right, who can go out and respond like that with purchasing a bike, are bringing their health risk on to the people of color who are going to be less likely to receive the health care that they need and less likely to survive in the event that they do contract the virus that constitutes this pandemic. So I joined tonight to inspire the bike and planning community, particularly grassroots organizers, those who are doing the work right now through Bridges for People, to challenge their conceptualization of what it is to have a battle and the concept of a job well done. Because it's too often that the vision is accepted as satisfactory when it's actually an incomplete job. And what do I mean by that? I mean, great, we've got a commitment from our administration on Queens and Brooklyn bridges to improve them and to make more space. But what about all the other bridges of New York City, and particularly the ones that connect to Uptown, the ones to the boroughs that are least desirable and less traveled? Bike lanes, bridges, the infrastructure du jour, whatever the case is, beyond this pandemic and before this pandemic, are often the ones that receive attention, are often the ones that are campaigned for by enough white neighbors who've been privileged through the gift of real estate segregation to have time, assets to participate in our campaigns, which are important, but they aren't essential. And the public space improvements get executed, but for whom? And I thought about it. It's kind of the job that happens when our geographically based advocacy goes forward is kind of the flip side of NIMBY. NIMBY is not in my backyard. And when I wrote down what I thought about it, I called it an Incombyati, ITCOMBYATI. I take care of my backyard, and that's it, because that's what happens. You know, we have initiatives, we say this needs to change, and in geographic pockets, Washington Heights works on Washington Heights, Queens, Sunset, or Sunnyside, and the East Side works on Queensboro Bridge. But there are people throughout the city who we know do not have the luxury of being civically engaged because their other needs are, because the need to have these improvements are less essential to their literal survival on a day-to-day basis. So I need everyone on this call to think about what happens to the McCombs Dam Bridge, where we know it's disjointed and people fall. I need people to think about, what about the Willis Avenue Bridge, where a cyclist died in December because he ran into a pedestrian? What about the 3rd Avenue Bridge, where it would be the most direct intersection right into Harlem, but it is an absolute death trap? These might not be your routes. You might never take that route. You might never have a destination on the other side. But to fulfill the mission that we say that we're working on, to be true to the campaigns that we name, Bridges for People, we have to honor and be reverential to the personhood of everybody, because somebody is somebody who matters to someone else, the way that you matter to someone else. So we might not be sharing the same backyards, but it is an impetus that you look over the fence or perhaps tear down the fence that's been defined for us for generations by negative policy to keep us apart. Because citywide activism on a geographic basis needs to evolve to truly make Bridges for People what it should be. There you have it.
Thank you, Courtney. That was a really powerful call to action for advocates, not just to focus on proximity and convenience, which is sometimes what we unfortunately do. Thank you. Our next speaker is Andrew Brown. Andrew is the Managing Director of Programs at Van Allen, where he oversees programs that mobilize designers to address pressing challenges in communities. Andrew is a researcher trained in empirical analysis of programs and public policy, and his work often explores how designers, city leaders, and communities can work together to create healthier, more prosperous neighborhoods. He has developed a wide range of program workshops that help US mayors promote shared prosperity through urban design, tours that help people visualize and understand how built environments impact mental health and the brain, and public conversations about the ways design can promote more inclusive, equitable, and beautiful cities. Andrew, welcome.
Great, thanks, Diane. And thanks to the entire Bridges for People team for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. I'm gonna leave it in this mode because I tried presentation mode earlier and that got really wonky, so apologize for the format, but please just bear with me. Yeah, so as Diane said, my name is Andrew Brown. I'm the Director of Programs at Van Allen. We're a nonprofit that mobilizes designers to promote equitable cities and inclusive design. Last year, our organization, along with the New York City Council, launched a competition called Reimagining Brooklyn Bridge. It was an international design competition that aimed to address uncomfortable and sometimes unsafe conditions on the Brooklyn Bridge. And we pushed designers to come up with some ideas that could address those challenges in ways that didn't just improve the bridge itself, but could spark a bigger conversation about New York City's infrastructure as a whole. Before I really jump into the presentation, I wanted to acknowledge the teams whose work I'll be referencing now when I share some of these ideas that they came up with. There are 3 teams of professionals that worked on these proposals in the finals round of the competition. They were Team Back to the Future. They're made up of Bjarke Ingels Group and Arup. There was Bridge X, Team Bridge X, made up of a small firm in Boston named Scenes Lab, supported by Minzy Long and Andrew Nash. And there was a winner of the competition, Team Brooklyn Bridge Forest. They were supported by pilot projects, Design Collective, Cities for Forests, Wildlife Conservation Society, Grimshaw, and Silman. In my presentation today, I'm just going to share some of the ideas and recommendations that came out of their proposals that speak directly to tonight's topic, creating more space for people on our bridges in ways that promote equity, inclusion, and beauty in the city. So the first big recommendation that came out of their work was making space for cyclists on the roadway. Here's a scene of a cyclist riding through a crowd. I think anybody who's been on the bridge is familiar with this. There's not really enough space for both folks to be on there safely. And so when we were thinking about this competition and what we wanted to put in the brief for designers to address, this was top of the list, and a lot of our thinking centered on expanding this roadway to give more space to people above the girders. And it was pretty quick that the designers that we tapped to be our finalists came back and said, you know, if you're looking for more space for biking on the bridge, you could expand the promenade, assuming that that's cost effective and even feasible from an engineering perspective. But honestly, if you want more space, it's already there. You just have to look at the roadway below. And all 3 teams really took that to heart. So this is the winning proposal, Brooklyn Bridge Forest. They included 2 bike lanes, both 2-way on both sides of the bridge. This is the proposal from Bridge X. They took the Brooklyn bound side and they included a 2-way bike lane on the innermost lane. And this was the proposal from the BRK Ingalls group team, where they took the outer lane on the Manhattan bound side, again, two-way, I believe is about 8 feet, which is what the mayor's office proposed. But in each case, you have that solution of saying, if you want to create more space for cyclists and pedestrians, you want to do it safely, the roadway is a good place to start that conversation, that search for additional space. And the next big point that came out of their work was, once you start giving designers some space, they just want more. So they started thinking, well, if we're going to introduce biking onto the roadway, well, what other uses could we do with that space as well? Here's just a scene of a typical day on the bridge. You have a lot of pedestrians on the deck on one side, and you have a lot of cars on the other. But if you think about how many trips are being made by what mode on a given day, there's just a serious imbalance of space between these two. So BRK Ingalls Group, they take an entire section of the roadway on the Brooklyn-bound side, and they just turn it over to pedestrians. Here, they're thinking of something that's more like, looks like what you would see in Times Square, just a lot of movable seating, a lot of movable tables, a food truck. Somebody just activates that space in a way that's removing cars and just making it more friendly for people who are on foot or on bike, but also introducing vendors, opportunities to sit down, opportunities for recreation, just imagining like a whole new way to use and activate the space once cars are removed from the equation. They came up with a range of programming ideas, like using public art or placing public art on the bridge, food trucks, Sky Garden, which is their idea for like a linear park on the bridge, and a number of other recreational uses as well. This is the Bridge X proposal, which also looked at taking the Brooklyn side of the roadway and just turning that over to recreational use. And they created these sections that show all the different ways in which that space could be activated. I think it's worth noting here that with all of the teams that are proposing these really radical changes in the way the roadway is used, they all accompanied those recommendations with phasing plans. So the idea was, if you're going to introduce a radically different use of a space, if you want to bring the public along and include them in that conversation, it's really smart not to do it all in one fell swoop. You really want to pilot it out, try it in bits and pieces, and give people the opportunity to see what these spaces look like once they're changed, get their feedback, and decide from there what changes you might want to make permanent and which ones you might want to scale back. That brings us to the third point here, using pilots and technology to engage communities and test new uses. This was really popular with the Brooklyn Bridge proposal. Here, this is showing their scheme of using augmented reality apps and mobile devices for people to use it as a visualization tool to actually see what change might happen on the bridge. And also they created a kit of parts where the city and communities could work together to really build out really quickly in a temporary way some different uses, so people could see them out in real life and get a sense of what it would actually feel like to be in that space with the bridge activated for a certain use. So you see schemes for building out site furniture, schemes for building out playscapes, playgrounds. And they created this scheme as a part of the proposal where people could, whether they're on the bridge or afterward, use their app or maybe connect with people, representatives of the city in real life, and actually share their feedback as to what the experience was like on the bridge, how they felt about those different uses, which ones, again, would they want to see more of, and which ones might they want to see scaled back. And this was a big part of this proposal, figuring out ways to not just include the community in some designer scheme that they've decided should be allowed on the bridge, but actually trying to create feedback loops that make this more of a conversation, so that designers, communities, and the city could come together, test out something on a pilot basis, and then in real time start getting feedback from users, from the community as to what they liked and what they would want to see on the bridge. Another big kind kind of recommendation from all of the teams, and this is something that we put in the brief, was the activation of the anchorages. So right now, the anchorages for the Brooklyn Bridge on both sides are fairly neglected and underutilized, and it represents a pretty big opportunity to bring some new open, green, and usable space online for people who are visiting the bridge. So here's a section from the from the big proposal where you see current conditions of the Manhattan Anchorage. And this is their proposed transformation of that space inside and out. So within the Anchorage, they're proposing communities, civic and recreational uses. On the outside, they brought in more trees, more plantings. They opened up the space for a host of recreational uses, just bringing people closer to the bridge, beautifying those spaces and giving people an opportunity to enjoy an area that right now is fairly neglected. Here is one side of the Manhattan Anchorage where the on-ramp connects back to the FDR. They were thinking in their scheme that they would take cars off of the bridge entirely. And if they were to do that, then the need for these ramps connecting to and from the FDR would be, in their view, unnecessary. So they came up with a long-term scheme that would knock that ramp down, daylight the street below, and create more opportunities for public space, for green space, and the activation of those anchorages, again, for recreational uses, for retail, for any sort of community use. Here's the Bridge proposal looking at the anchorages again. On the left, you see what they would do for activating it for vendors or for performers. On the right, you see a cultural and art use through projection. I think this is one of the more exciting ideas that came through the proposal, this idea that you could use projection in an art context to introduce more narratives to a space and change the way we think about it and talk about it without making anything, any serious capital or physical changes to the space at all. It just seemed like a really great idea. It's something that we're seeing more and more in cities and in public art projects. And the idea of bringing that to an iconic structure like the Brooklyn Bridge is just a very exciting prospect to think about. And here's the winning scheme, the Brooklyn Bridge Forest, and their activation of an Anchorage. Here they've turned it into a giant park with a bicycle ramp that would connect up to the bridge and some stalls for vendors plugged into the actual Anchorage itself. And within their scheme, they really talked and modeled out a lot of approaches to community engagement. And the hope was that the activation of these spaces would be something that you could turn over to the community. So for programming, you'd be working with community groups to figure out, what are the best uses as cultural or recreational for that space. And then when it comes to the vendors who are working out those spaces, again, connecting with local businesses and maybe rotating in and out different businesses that could use and take advantage of that space. The fifth recommendation is improving access to the bridge. Here is kind of one of my favorite images of current conditions because it really highlights what's going on. So in the background, you have the beauty, the grace, the splendor of the towers of the bridge in the background. And in the foreground, you have the cluster, of tourists and people and commuters and vendors all jockeying for space in an area that's just not big enough to accommodate all of them. I think one of the issues is if we're trying to improve how people get across the span, it's really critical that we also look at the entrances and the exits as well to make sure that all the improvements that we're making for people to get across the bridge are also that they're reflected when people get off and when they get on in the first place. So this is a site map of the Manhattan entrance that Big put together in their proposal, which I think is really worth talking about now, because in their vision, they're thinking about how people get off of that bridge, whether they're on bike or on foot. And they would take the section of Center Street that's immediately adjacent to City Hall Park, and they would remove it from cars. And in essence, create a continuous space that links up that City Hall Park with the entrance on the other side, which instantly makes that space a lot more comfortable for not just the tourists who are there, but for the people who are commuting by bike, for the vendors who are operating. It's a way now that I think we're talking about a bike lane being introduced on the innermost lane on the Manhattan bound side. and considering what that exit is like today, this site map, I think, is really worth referencing in terms of thinking about, again, how you can make that entrance and exit point as beneficial to a wide range of users as possible. Here, the Bridge X team is looking at the Brooklyn bound side, thinking about if you take cars off of the ramps that circle around and through Cabin Plaza, Cabin Park, and you give that over, take it away from cars and give it over to pedestrians and to bicyclists, what that experience could be like. Here it is showing people being able to bike freely through this green space and walk through that, and showing more signage to just make the connections to the bridge and to points of interest around the neighborhood more clear. That was a really big point with regard to improving access, was clear wayfinding to help people navigate these spaces and really understand the activity and opportunities for connecting with stuff that's already going on in the neighborhood that that space is running through. And the last point, which I think is a good one and a big one to consider, is to think about the bridges, these East River crossings, as being part of a bigger system. So the Bridge X proposal, I think, illustrates this idea really well. So again, they were the team that thought that the entire Brooklyn bound section of the bridge could be turned over to pedestrians. And so they actually asked themselves, well, what do we do with cars at that point? And their thinking was, rather than consider this a reason to panic, just recognize that all of that's going to be offset. Some of it will go over the Manhattan Bridge, some of it will go to the Battery Tunnel, some of this will be absorbed by public transportation. There's encouraging people to really think that if you take cars out of the equation, that's not a doomsday issue, partly because you have so many other options for people across the East River to get across in that vehicle. So I think thinking about it in these terms actually makes it a bit more like proposing a change, such as taking bridges off of one part, or taking cars off of one part of the bridge. It makes it a little bit more feasible if you're able to explain across a host of crossings, how that change might be absorbed. Here's just a clear articulation of how they saw those the 57% of diverted vehicles being absorbed by other bridges and other modes of transportation. And here it's a similar approach that the big team took, but with their scheme, they didn't just take cars off of one side of the bridge, but they took cars off the bridge altogether. And even then, they're still showing that there's not really a cause to panic, and partly because not only are they showing how other connections would pick up all that displaced traffic, they're also acknowledging the need for a policy push here with reduced demand owed to congestion pricing. I think this is a really important point to note. Rather than taking more of, I would say, like a passive approach and thinking, oh, if we take cars off the bridge, where will all that diverted traffic just end up? Here they're saying, well, if you want to take all the cars off the bridge and free up that space, you might want to take a more proactive approach with policy and really push, transportation, push congestion pricing, get to a place where those cars are just displaced, but the need for them is sort of removed from the landscape altogether. That was it. Thank you so much for the time. It was great to get to share these ideas with you from our proposal. And just a quick note that if you are interested in any of these proposals and you'd like to see them in full, they're all up on our website at the web address below. And I'll be sure to share this with the Bridges for People team so they can share that with everybody after the meeting. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I just wanted to remind our attendees tonight, if you have a question, you can throw that into the Q&A box. We will devote the last 15 minutes to answering questions. And then if you've heard anything tonight that you're super inspired about, feel free to share it on all of the social channels with #BridgesForPeople. Our last speaker of the evening is Council Member Stephen Levin. Council Member Levin was elected in 2009 to represent the 33rd District, which includes Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Vinegar Hill, Dumbo, Brooklyn Heights, downtown Brooklyn, Burham Hill, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. In addition to serving as chair of the General Welfare Committee, Councilmember Levin currently serves on the Education, Environmental Protection, Government Operations, land use, small business, standard and ethics, and transportation committees, as well as the subcommittee on zoning and franchises. Welcome, council member.
Thanks very much, Diane. It's nice to see you guys. Thank you, Andrew, for that fantastic presentation. Thank you, Courtney, for your amazing words, and I think kind of centering this discussion. And thanks to Danny for having me. And it's nice to be here with all of you guys. So I'll keep my remarks pretty brief. I think from my end, I don't have any amazing insight into the specifics of the plans, and I think that Andrew really did that really comprehensively. But I think what maybe the purpose that I could serve, and I think why I was asked to be part of this, was kind of talking about political strategy, really, of how do we get from these great ideas to implementation. And these are big plans, no pun intended, but these are massive evolutions in terms of the way that that we'll be approaching infrastructure and transportation in the next decade and beyond. And first off, I think that TA needs no lessons from me in terms of advocacy. TA is among the best advocates in New York City as an organization. Obviously, all the work that TA has done with Families for Safe Streets, which is, I think if you were to ask, council members and people that are engaged in public life and people that work at the city council, who's been the most kind of impactful in like a hit you in the gut kind of way. Families for Safe Streets has been remarkable in how they turn their pain and grief into concrete policies that they will get up and advocate for every day. I think of I've gotten really close with Harold and Debbie Kahn, and they lost their son Seth, who I didn't know, but I've gotten to know his parents really, really well, and they're wonderful people. And I just think of that as such an inspiration. So, I think the first thing that I would say is that, taking that personal advocacy that TA does so well, and that Families for Safe Streets has done so well, and kind of making the case that this is how we put progressive policies, progressive vision into, this is how we actually implement it. And so I think kind of just continuing to keep that message loud and clear. Again, I think that, TA needs no lessons from me, but kind of the idea of constantly, being clear about what you're asking for, being concise and concrete. So it's not at all wishy-washy. It's not abstract at all. These are real plans for real infrastructure, and so I think that tends to be very effective. And I think that the challenge is you're always going to be dealing with this kind of prevalent car culture. Council members often do drive cars. I drove a car for the first number of years that I was in the council. And so, I think that like there's and council members are coming from all over the city, and there are neighborhoods that are far away. And so, the council member from Canarsie or Queens Village, might kind of scratch their head and say, well, how am I supposed to get there without a car? And, how are my constituents supposed to get there without a car? And so that's kind of like, I think one kind of challenge, but there's effective ways of being persuasive that you know how to do. The other main thing that I've kind of learned over the years when looking to accomplish kind of seismic things is using things that are happening at the same time, or as you know, using the circumstances around you, and knowing kind of when to leverage those things. So for example, you know, with congestion pricing, you know, becoming real in the coming years, you know, that's going to be this big opportunity, because you most definitely will be seeing a significant decrease in car traffic over the bridges, and it kind of gives that opportunity to say, all right, now is the time when we can actually really imagine this. And so I think kind of really making sure that, you know, using that as kind of a jumping off point to kind of supercharge the advocacy. And then, you know, I think also making the case to, you know, this is again where TA is so good, is making the case to, in a very local way. So, you know, having community workshops. I know TA's done a million community workshops in my district. It's sad that we're doing everything online, but how many workshops has TA done in like the Greenpoint Library about local Greenpoint transportation issues, or in in the southern part of my district around around the bridges. And so I think kind of using that kind of localized organizing strategy is really shown dividends over the years in terms of having an impact. I fully expect the next council to be very progressive. I am keeping an eye on candidates. I'm not running for anything myself, so I'm like at home with my kids and like following the campaigns on Twitter. So am fascinated at how many fantastic, mostly young, very progressive candidates there are throughout the city, in districts in Queens, in districts in the Bronx, lots of districts in Brooklyn. And so, you know, there's going to be this opportunity with the next council where, you can really make some inroads on these transportation issues and these big transportation infrastructure projects. One last thing that I think would be so compelling also about these is that, you know, these aren't like $200 million projects. I mean, one of the challenges, I was just watching with Andrew's presentation with the Bjarke Ingels plan. You know, we engaged with Bjarke Ingels. They did a proposal for the BQE, which was fascinating, and that's in my district, where the proposal that they had was to cover it over and make open space go over it. This is on the Brooklyn Bridge Park, triple cantilever side of the BQE on the Brooklyn side. And, you know, one of the challenges there is you're talking about, like, you know, at the end of the day, that's a $7 billion infrastructure project that is, you know, just so unbelievably enormous that, like, who knows if it ever gets, like, who knows what they're going to do. I mean, they just basically kick the can down the road because it's so massive. And like, if you just do that part of the BQE, should you be doing the entire stretch of the BQE? But if it's $8 billion or $7 billion to do this, then it's going to be like $20 million to do from the Verrazano to Queens. And then if you're going to do all that, why are we even investing in cars? You know, that much investment in cars anyway. So that's a very challenging, hard nut to crack. That the BQE question, and I don't envy the people that are really going to be digging into that next year and beyond. This is, you know, in comparison, is cheap. I mean, this could be done for, you know, probably a few $1 million. It's really just about changing, using and leveraging the changes that are already going to be happening from the implementation of congestion pricing to make these kind of larger kind of paradigm changes. They're not like super expensive infrastructure changes. They're just paradigm changes. And I think that they would make a huge difference. I'll just end with my excitement for these plans, because as a cyclist, I mean, I haven't cycled to work in I think the last time I cycled into work was like 364 days ago. But I haven't really left my apartment much since then. But I loved cycling in from Greenpoint to City Hall, and never ever took the Brooklyn Bridge because of the just the unbelievable congestion. It was way too stressful for me. It was like I couldn't handle it. So any opportunity I'd take to just go on the Manhattan Bridge or the Williamsburg on the way in, so or the way out. So anyway, I think that this is going to be really exciting, and I think that it's kind of using those points. My two main points are using the points of leverage that you have, so taking circumstances as they come up and using them in the most using those opportunities in the best way possible, and doing that local advocacy, and that bringing that personal touch to it. So that personal story I think is really effective, and anticipating a very progressive council next time around, and really making the most of that too. So I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Council Member Levin.
Thanks, Anne.
So this portion of the evening is going to be a quick panel discussion. So if all the panelists can turn their cameras on, that would be fantastic. Great. I was really moved about all of the discussion about inclusivity and equity. And I think from a planning perspective or from an advocacy perspective, it would be really helpful to hear if there's policies or processes or metrics that we can look to keep both communities that are trying to realize some of the plans in 25 by 25, as well as the local government accountable. So what if anyone can speak to mechanisms that exist or policies that are maybe in the works that haven't been passed yet, that would be awesome. Anyone want to take that question?
I mean, I don't know if I prescribe like a specific approach, but just thinking about all the things that Courtney said, really about asking yourself, who are these changes for that you want to bring into a city? I think thinking about the presentation that I just gave and all the ideas that came through, the proposals, it's like those sorts of schemes, those sorts of design moves and ideas really need to be bookended by exactly what Courtney was talking about. And I think that mindset really needs to sit on top of any sort of change that you would want to make with regard to planning or policy or any sort of initiative. So it's really, starting off by asking the equity questions and inclusion questions. Who is this change for? How are people going to be reflected in that change? How do they benefit from it? How do they contribute to it? And then we take a walk around the neighborhood and we say like, well, what are the opportunities to transform space? How do we make mobility safe for a different range or a wider range of users? How do we make people feel welcome in this space? What does it feel like when you're walking around? And then when you come up with drawings, renderings, ideas of how you're going to physically transform a landscape, you come right back to what Courtney was talking about. And you say, okay, who is this for? What is the process by which this transformation is going to happen that people are often left behind will have some ownership in it? Not just a stake or a say in what goes on in the neighborhood, but they actually get to own a piece of it, right? And I think specifically around issues around like commercial uses or cultural uses, right? Like I just talked about activating anchorages on either side of the bridge, right? You can activate those spaces with anything, right? Like Prada could have a shop inside one of the Anchorage bays, or you could set up shop for small business incubator for immigrants who've newly arrived, right? Both of those things are commercial uses. what the difference is somebody has to have a conversation that's serious about when we propose a change, who will benefit from this and who will be a part of it. So again, sorry, that's not like a very specific pointed thing for people to do, but these are the issues that I think about in the work that I do at Van Allen.
No, those are great insights. In looking at your designs, I was struck by how much space there was for like leisure activity. And I guess this is another question for all of the panelists. How do we think about, specifically with bridge space, the right mix of space for leisure versus transportation?
Before we move on, Diana.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, no, sorry. No need. But thanks, Andrew, for the reference, because I was looking at the questions and someone asked the time-tested question about the hostility of gentrification, right? And that they were asking if gentrification does bring, like, or bike lanes bring gentrification. And this goes hand in hand with like changing one's mindset about advocacy and interaction, right? The reason that there's a perception that gentrification brings, or that bike lanes bring gentrification, is because of exactly what happens, right? That communities that are predominantly white don't take a stake in their neighbors' well-being until they themselves feel that they have control of an environment and want to cater it to themselves, right? That's what the hostility is about. It's about not valuing someone else's presence and needs and humanity until you decide that it also serves you, like it's a self-serving thing. So the difference is ultimately, when it comes to being an advocate and is becoming a facilitator and not a dictator of space, right? You don't want to appear in a community all of a sudden and say, this is what's going to happen, and this is how it's going to happen, right? It's kind of the secondary step to already giving a hoot the whole time is then, once you decide to engage, is say, all right, I'm engaging for the well-being of the people who are here. So it's impossible to just lay down your law and your preferences and say that you're serving someone else. So I just wanted to put that to that as well.
Can I just add one thing to what Andrew and Courtney were saying? It struck me, people with disabilities in our city are, it's kind of hard with those that don't have a disability for me to really understand how challenging our environment, our built environment, makes mobility for people with disabilities. And this is, there are opportunities that we could use through this kind of visioning process to really put the needs of senior citizens and others with disabilities in the forefront in terms of public planning in a way that we very rarely do. When we do it, it's kind of some kind of perfunctory thing, but not front and center in terms of the initial planning.
Thank you. Danny, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the thoughts that have already been raised. I guess the piece that I would include also is what we know works and what neighborhoods we know have been left behind in that process. So in addition to obviously bringing communities in to understand what their needs are, how they think about space and how they think about mobility, we know that the majority of crashes take place in the minority of locations. We know that there are proven street safety measures that the city has at its disposal, that it rolls out and continues to leave out particular neighborhoods, especially when you look at where the protected bike lane infrastructure is, where daylighting of intersections are. And even, as unfortunately in my role, I've had to attend more vigils than I ever thought I'd have to in my life. Is that you go and you hear communities that are and have been yelling quite simply that they just want to be able to walk across the street and get their kids to school safety, whether it's in Bath Beach where a 7-year-old was killed just crossing the street on her scooter, or out in East New York, where at the same intersection, 2 children were killed just simply walking across the street. So there are other sort of proven methods that the city has that it needs to roll out across the city to every intersection and prioritize low-income and communities of color, the same way that when we talk about bike parking, or even look at, the hopeful changes of moving, traffic enforcement out of NYPD into DOT, and looking at the role of the crash investigation squad and saying, if the city knows where crashes are occurring and why they occurred, that they have a responsibility to immediately bring about engineering changes, not just to that intersection, but to others across the city. So I think it's important that we also look at the fact that our city's challenge is not about innovation in these ideas. It's about scaling them and scaling them to the communities who need them the most.
That's a great point. Just to stay, Courtney had already mentioned some lists or some bridges that she hopes for Bridges for People to take on next. Maybe everyone can just mention like what bridge they'd like to see added to our campaign that's not currently part of our movement.
Is it fair to just yell all the bridges?
I'm excited. I'm not from the Bronx, but I think what Courtney mentioned, Macon's Dam Bridge and Willis Avenue Bridge were, I think those were really compelling.
And I think that I know that the next 2 big campaigns for Bridges for People is the Washington Bridge up between Bronx and Manhattan, and the Verrazano Bridge, which is obviously, that's a big one as well.
I live in Sunset Park, so I would vote for Verrazano for sure.
Lucia Dang is up in the Bronx, and I believe is headlining, but like really taking a lot of charge over the Washington Ave Bridge. But comparative, like let's look at it comparative to the amount of people who are involved in the Brooklyn Committee, who show up all the time and have made the moves on that, versus, when I say like who's working in the Bronx, and they're like, oh, there's this one person. So there's one person, you all, who's online, who needs you all to, share some of your time, effort, and energy, assisting them get to where they're going. So that's the kind of spirit I'm talking about.
I'm being told we're at time. So we will now move to the Q&A portion of the evening. We have so many amazing questions already in the chat, and there may be others that folks want to still add to the chat or the Q&A. To lead the Q&A session is Raquel Thompson, who's one of our amazing volunteers. Take it away, Raquel.
Yeah, so thank you all so much. Diane, you asked a lot of the great questions people were wondering about. I think asking about the state bridges, these ones that are controlled by the not just the MTA, but actually by the state of New York, like the Triborough and the Verrazano. What is the strategy there, and how do we make that happen? Because it's a very different political aspect. So I was hoping you all could talk a little bit about that. Danny.
Yeah, I'm happy to put in a few words. Look, obviously in these cases, the target is the governor, and we've been heartened to see some legislation that was advanced just yesterday and while it's, it doesn't force, but it would put forward a request to add sort of deeper studies and work for the MTA to look at bike infrastructure. And, whatever you think about Moynihan Station, you also probably realize that there was not a place to park your bike when you got there. So, there are very sort of deep issues that relate to the MTA thinking holistically about multimodal transit. So the fact that, there's not secure bike parking, especially at MTA facilities, whether they're at bus stops or at, major train stations, the fact that, still accessibility on MTA bridges is at best an afterthought. And if you look at, some of the great work that came out of Streets blog, that, there were also tactics that were used to really sort of overinflate the potential cost of bike infrastructure on the Verrazano. And it turned out to be, a fraction of what had been presented at the time. So I think, a lot of what we need to do, and it's what, we're pushing with 25 by 25 and Councilmember Levin. I think we're also inspired by sort of a new wave of leaders who think holistically and recognize that, again, this is not just about bikes. This is about public health. This is about equity. This is about economic recovery. This is about supporting essential workers. This is about lifting low-income communities of color out of generational poverty. Is that we need sort of a holistic approach that will come from new leadership. And, we know in New York City we'll have new leadership, and in Albany we're still, I guess, waiting to see what will happen. But, recognizing that there will be a change there too at some point. So, that obviously doesn't sort of change the way that we need to fight. It just means that we need to continue to push and fight that, bridges can serve as access points to connect people to opportunity. And we need to sort of be moving away from this trench warfare approach where we're going bridge to bridge or street to street. And we need a broader holistic approach that looks at everything from changing level of service up in Albany, which is something that is a multi-year campaign that we're focused on, to thinking about how to reimagine street space across the entire city of New York. These are, I think, the big ideas and the big moment for all of us to be standing together and, again, fighting for more than the scraps that we've been getting up to this point, including Bridges for People.
I'll just add really quickly that, I've been in politics for 15 years now, and the state legislature is the most progressive body that I've seen in New York since I've been around. So more progressive than the council and the state Senate in particular. So I think there's opportunities working with the state Senate and Assembly to really get progressive legislation, with a new governor eventually, that will, hopefully they'll be willing to cede some of that power. I mean, the governor's power is very significant, but, it's going to require, I think, the state legislature really pushing to take some of that away, and maybe there will be an opportunity to do that.
Great, that's really helpful. And I think as we continue, it's going to be so important to think of it, as you said, Danny, not about trench warfare, but making that impact kind of across the board. And kind of going off of that, Henry is asking about, the 25 by 25 campaign is very ambitious, but obviously needs kind of community buy-in. What is the kind of dream organizations that you'd like to have sign on to 25 by 25 to kind of push that forward?
Well, I mean, we've been incredibly fortunate that, we've done outreach to more than 250 organizations and individuals and businesses across the city, and we've had 120 coalition partners join. So, I think if you look at the campaigns that TA has been a part of in the past, whether it's for open streets or for speed cameras, it's a diverse coalition of people in this case who hopefully see streets as an asset in support of their goals and values. If you look at the report, especially the implementation section, we're not being prescriptive of what will happen on your block or in a neighborhood. We're simply presenting a vision of how streets can help to lift up our most vulnerable, support our economic recovery, help address, inequities, especially if they've played out with COVID. And as a result, it means that we've been so fortunate to have, now this growing coalition of partners join. So I would say that if you are an organization, regardless of, the kind of work that you do that's thinking about building a better future for New York, we've had school groups come in because they see their future as creating schools that are, safer ways for kids to get to school. We've had environmental justice organizations that have joined because they clearly see how, our transportation policy is polluting the air and killing our residents. We see Bronx Health Reach has joined because whether it's the asthma alley or the fact that, the quarter of Bronx residents are healthcare workers who also have the longest commute in New York. I think the nice part of it is that people can view streets as a canvas in support of their goals and issues. And ultimately our plan helps to put power over street decision-making back in the hands of residents. So whether it's taking trash off of the sidewalk or, creating more open streets, or most importantly, helping to create, dedicated space where the community can determine what could go there. But it's really starting with safety, and then, thinking about how we can create a better space where, our streets are not 19,000 lane miles of roads and 3 million free parking spaces, but that this space can support our shared future.
Thank you. And I guess kind of opening it up more broadly, Steve, Courtney, Andrew, are there any organizations that you wish were like more consulted more often or brought into the process, like specifically? I'm sure that there are a number, but just so that we can kind of keep thinking about those organizations.
I can say that I would like to see more housing organizations brought into transportation issues because they go together. In other cities, they work toward transit-oriented development, right? So that you can have multiple modes of, I live here, here's my nearest train station, or here's the distance, right? And in New York City, we're talking about people who are thinking about social justice and rights, right? And inclusivity at all times and equity. And most of the people who are there are more apt to be active, and accepting of alternative modes of transportation. So I would really like to see more housing.
Just following up on what Courtney and Danny said, I think schools would be amazing to really work with, getting the word out there among young people, because it's amazing how they've been organizing in recent years around climate, around guns, and then NYCHA resident associations. I have 7 NYCHA developments in my district. There's tens of thousands of NYCHA residents in my district, and and they need to be front and center in these discussions.
I would say, like bids and CDCs. I'm sure they're already on the radar, but I think especially now, so many businesses having a hard time with COVID, making sure that the needs of the smaller businesses in the streets are well understood, and getting information out to them in terms of like not just reopening safely or operating safely, but when we talk about like the streetscape is like dramatically changing. And like this could be an enormous opportunity for mom and pops, not just increase the amount of space in which they operate, but to engage with customers in the community in a different way, perhaps a more dynamic way, to have them be a part of like the transportation conversation, by proxy conversation of like how the streetscape is dramatically changing and being transformed, how they could be at the center of that and benefit from that and contribute to that in a meaningful way. I'd like to see them engaged more. I know that they're like, not every bid is beloved by their neighborhood. I know that, but I think even if we could use this opportunity to maybe like rehabilitate some of the relationships that exist between those organizations, organizations, those bids, and the businesses that they serve and the communities that they serve, that would be a great opportunity as well, or a great way to use this work.
Great, thank you. Those are all very thought-provoking and things that I certainly hadn't always considered. So really appreciate you all bringing that up. And I think that most of the questions have been answered, rather whether they're coming from Diane or from me. And just kind of to end on like a positive, because I know we're coming up on time. This one is for Blythe, which was kind of, what was your favorite team building win or your favorite moment? Actually, all y'all, because you've all been involved in some way throughout the Bridges for People process. What's been your favorite moment from the situation?
My favorite was just getting together with people in person, at socially distanced, of course, with our amazing Bridges for People masks. But I think the pandemic has been a real reminder of what's great about New York is when we can come together in our common public spaces. And this is a campaign about increasing those spaces and making them better for people. But just campaigning itself and the activism is bringing us together, both virtually and when it's safe physically. And that's a wonderful thing.
I met most of the folks who are foundational or like pioneers, I guess, at the Manhattan kickoff, more or less, right? So that's where you all started generating all of your wonderful ideas for the actions that you took. So I recall that.
Does this count? Can I use this?
Absolutely, of
Oh,
course.
this is great. I mean, I feel like, especially because I work in urban design, sometimes you feel like the conversations can get very aesthetic and very dreamy, and you kind of worry that you're getting too removed from the real world. So the chance to sit down and talk to people who are like on the ground, activists really mobilizing communities and trying to make positive changes is great. It was a really pleasure and honor to hear about all the great work that you're doing. And to share a little bit about what we're working on at Van Allen. So to have these opportunities I really appreciate those so much.
I think there's something really important about history too to these campaigns. And when we were gathering to do the takeover of the Queensboro Bridge, and there had been a few people who had been doing this work for almost 40 years, and they were there too. That's incredibly important to keep and maintain the history of these campaigns, and also recognize that it takes time and work. And I would say the other sort of lighter piece is Blythe and Catherine, as you were all sort of coming into Gracie Mansion in your costumes, I think there was maybe a couple people who had no idea what you were doing and just thought it was a ride, and were just sort of standing there as part of the campaign outside of the rally. And somebody asked them, well, what's your favorite bridge? And they said, I have no idea what I'm doing here. I just thought this was a costume ride. So wonderful to sort of keep it as a fun and inclusive tool that can bring all people in, whether they're in costume or not. So keep it up.
But I had to step aside for a second. I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
Well, you're good. Just your favorite moment of this whole campaign and process.
I think, I think I'm hoping it's one in the future where we all get to be with each other again in person and doing rides and just being able to kind of have that in-person experience, I think, is something that I'm just looking forward to. So I'm gonna tag some future date, I think. That's okay.
We'll take that from the past to the future. I think that's a perfect way to end it. So I'll pass this on back to Blythe to close us out, I think, or is it Catherine? Someone is closing it out.
Catherine, my co-chair of the campaign.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you, Raquel, and everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Oh dear, I shared it the wrong way, sorry. All right, so this has been fantastic. Thank you all so much to our speakers for being here. And, I have to give a shout out to Diane Martins, who is one of the many, but definitely the prominent volunteer who dreamed this up and brought this to life and led the panel discussion at the beginning. This has just been such a unique opportunity to do this online organizing in the midst of a pandemic. But through it, and I'm sure all of us have met incredible people who are doing incredible work and will continue to do so. I'm sharing also our coalition partners page from our Bridges for People website. We have a website, bridgesforpeople.com, for the number 4. We couldn't do this without their help either. And we would love to incorporate more coalition partners moving forward. So if you know of anyone or any organization or business who might be interested in partnering with Bridges for People, please feel free to get in touch, and we would love to hear from you. So without further ado, what is something that you can do to get more involved starting right now? 3 things. Please go to our website, like I said, and sign the Bridges for People petition. It is now in Spanish as well as English, and you can share it with your friends and loved ones who might be interested in creating more space for people on any of our Manhattan, Williamsburg, and Brooklyn bridges. In addition to that, since we are trying to broaden this moment and this movement to other boroughs and other bridges, we have activist committees from Transportation Alternatives in all of the boroughs. So if you go to transalt.org/committees, you can find your local committee and find out when their monthly activist meeting is taking place. I happen to know, because I am also the co-chair of the Brooklyn committee with Blythe, that our meeting is coming up a week from Thursday at 7 p.m. But before then, the North Brooklyn committee is meeting on Monday the 11th at 7. And I'm sorry, Monday the 15th at 7. And I believe Manhattan committee has a meeting this Thursday, the 11th at 6:30 p.m. But all of the committees should be represented there. And finally, Transportation Alternatives also has a series of activist trainings called Your City, Your Voice, which, if you're new to activism, or if you kind of just want to brush up on some things, that's a great way to get involved and find out about things. Everything from starting a campaign to speaking to your elected officials, should you not know them as well as we know some of ours. So without further ado, the last thing I'll say is, if you learned anything tonight, or if you would like to engage with us further, again, please find us at Bridges for People on Twitter, Instagram, and use the hashtag Bridges for People to speak out on social media and try to increase the momentum. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night.